Hi everyone, and happy holidays. It's time for the December blocks for our Civil War sew-along. We're using Barbara Brackman's book, Civil War Sampler, for this project, and we began the program way back in March of 2024. So we're getting to the end of the program. We've been doing technically one block a week for the entire year because there are 50 blocks in the quilt. But honestly, rather than assign them week by week, I do them month by month. And December this year has 5 Sundays, so we'll be doing 5 blocks this month. Now, one of the first things that I did when I started was to cut the spine off of the book and then have the pages drilled or hole punched so that I could put them into a binder like this. And I also then go back and added page protectors. So as I finish a block, it slides into the page protector between the pages, and as you can see, we've got a lot of our blocks finished. I'm working on more than one project, so what you're going to see me working on today are the ones from the red and cream using Kim Deal's Garnets and Gingham fabric line. This month we're doing 5 blocks, and for December those blocks are number 19, 25, 26, 29, and 39. So if you're ready, let's get started. Our first block for this month is number 19, the Ohio Star. The Ohio Star is probably the most recognizable 9-patch block, besides simply sewing 9 squares together. By 9-patch, we refer to that when 3 rows of 3 blocks are sewn together, for a total of 9 blocks sewn together to make up the pattern. You can sew 9 solid squares together to make a 9-patch block, or the Ohio Star, which is quarter square triangles and solid squares sewn together, also make up a 9-patch block. Now the problem that I have is that Barbara offers the patterns in this book, the cutting instructions for an 8-inch and a 12-inch. If you're making the 12-inch, this is very easy because these are 4-inch finished squares. So you would cut them 4.5, and then 4, 4, and 4 would make up your 12-inch block. But when you have to make it in an 8-inch size, converting the 9-inch finished to an 8-inch finished doesn't always work comfortably mathematically. So what Barbara has you do is work with 1/16 of an inch, and then she puts in these little hints for piecing about using a scant seam allowance to get everything to work out. Because, to be honest, the math doesn't work. It has to be 1/16 of an inch that you change in order to actually have the block be the correct size. So rather than do that, I'm going to alter the instructions, and we're going to do it what I call a floating 9-patch. So our points are not going to touch the edge of the block. We're going to have a little more background around the outside edge. And here's how we're going to do that. Now, I'll put a blue screen up for the cutting instructions, but you're going to want to pay attention to how we put this together. So I'm going to use this green mat because I think it'll be a little bit easier for you to see. But we're going to make our quarter square triangles the exact same way that they're made in the book. So we're not changing anything there except for the size. I used 4-inch squares. So I had a 4-inch square of my background, a 4-inch square of what we call the inner points, and 2 4-inch squares of what will be my star points for my Ohio Star. I took those 4-inch squares and cut them diagonally twice, once in each direction, so that I ended up with 4 triangles for each of my Ohio Star points. Now when you put those together, they're going to measure, well, it's a little bit more than 3.5, slightly more than 3.5. And that doesn't really matter because we're going to trim these down. In order to float our Ohio Star, I need a little more background than I do on my points. So we're going to trim. The first thing I'm going to do is turn this around this way because you want to trim the first side with the inner star here. So this inner point section. So leave the background the way that it is. Now I need this to finish at 2.5 inches, the whole quarter square triangle. My width needs to be 2.5 inches. So I need to add seam allowance to that. So I would cut it at 3 inches. So for my center point, I want to measure out 1.5 inches. So I'm going to use my square ruler here, and I'm going to put the 1 1/2 inch place intersection right there so that it's right on that line. You can see that the diagonal line on my ruler goes from point to point here, and I'm going to be trimming a little more than 1/4 inch off those two sides. So I'm going to hold my ruler in place, and I'll trim here and here. Now remember, I want a finished size of 2.5, so I have to have my square measure 3. I need 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side. So I'm going to rotate my ruler, and I'm not going to trim anything off the top, but I am going to trim it to measure 3 inches. Now it doesn't really matter where I line that up. I think that's easier for you to see that my corner down here is on that line, and this vertical line is along the edge, and it measures 3 inches. So that's 1, 2, 3 inches across. So I'll trim just this side. I don't want to trim the top at all. So now what I have is a rectangle which has a quarter square triangle in it and a little bit of extra across the top. Now it was important that I trim these two sides first because I want those points to be exact. These have a little bit of extra fabric on them, but make sure that you trim those 2 points first. So now I'm going to take that and I'm going to sew it between my 2 squares. Now I cut these squares 3.5, so they're a little bit too large. That's okay because we're going to trim this down anyhow. So I will make 4 of these. So there will be 1, 2, 3, and 4 here. My center square is going to be cut 3. I need it to finish at 2.5. So when I've sewn these together, you'll see that it will take up slightly. And then when I sew my rows together, you can see that I'll have extra 1/2 inch on either side of my points. That way, when I trim this square to 8.5 and I sew it into my blocks, it will come in 1/4 inch and my star will float in the center of my 8-inch finished block. Let me sew these together and I'll show you what the finished block looks like. Now I've sewn the squares on my corners on either side of my quarter square triangle unit. So you can see when you put this unit together, you have extra background fabric here. Now I cut my corner squares 3.5. In the cutting instructions, you only need to cut them 3.25 to make your block. I made mine a little larger so I had room to trim. And you can do the same as you would like. I will give you a blue screen for the cutting instructions for this block, but you'll have to pay attention to the video for the trimming instructions. Now remember, you want to have these points meet, so when you trim your quarter square triangles, make sure that these angle lines are at the corner of your square. So now, to trim this to 8.5, I've already trimmed these 2 units. I'm going to use my ruler from Creative Grids, and this is the 8.5 inch size that I've been using for all the blocks in this particular quilt. And all Creative Grids rulers now have the centering lines here, and those are white lines and they designate the center of the ruler. You also have that diagonal line. So what I've done is I've laid this out so that that white line runs right through the intersection on my quarter square triangles, all 4 of them. And then I can hold it in place and trim here and across here. And then I'll have to rotate to trim the opposite side. So once I have that trimmed up, we'll be all ready to go. So this is block number 19, and we're going to call this one a floating Ohio star, because when you sew this together now, you won't have a 1/4 of an inch. You'll have a little bit of extra background around the outside edge. Next up is the Ladies' Aid album block. And I actually did a video on how to put this block together, but for some reason that video file is missing, so we're retaping it. Now, the block is easy to put together because the center square here is one square that's 3.5 inches. The corner squares that are over here are 4 squares that are 3 inches. So that means that these finish at 2.5. So 2.5 and 2.5 would be 5, meaning the center unit finishes at 3 to get us to the 8-inch finish size. So this piece, which is B, the 4 rectangles, in your book, they're cut 1.5 by 3.5, and that's perfect. The only difference I have to begin with is that Barbara has you cut C as a square and then cut it diagonally twice to get the 4 triangles that you would need here. And then you take 4 more squares and you cut those in half one time to get the corners to make that flying geese unit. Now, whether Barbara was not aware of how to clip a corner with a square, or whether she wasn't using any specialty, or whether they just didn't do that during the Civil War, so that's the way she put it together, I'm not sure. But I think there's much easier ways to make that flying geese unit, especially if you have a quick trim and circle ruler or a corner clipping ruler. So for that, you would need your rectangle piece here to be 3.5 by 2, and then you would need 2-inch squares to clip your corners. So you would need 8 2-inch squares, and then your 2-inch by 3.5-inch rectangles that will make your finished size flying geese 1.5 by 3. So when you put those together, then you would have your finished block. Now you can notice over here, I write in my books because they're mine. So I'm going to put little marks here where you can, instead of cutting one large triangle or one large square for the corner, you can cut a smaller square right there, and that would finish off as a 6-inch block. And then we can put a border around the outside edge. And that's what I've chosen to do with mine. So this is my Ladies' Aid album block. So this is a 6-inch finished block that I've added a 1-inch border on all sides to. So these are my flying geese. This was a 2-inch square here and here. This was cut 2.5 by 3.5, and then I clipped the corners to make my flying geese. So the only change I've made is the way that I made my flying geese, and then I added this corner square for a little more interest. And the reason that I did that is because if you remember back here, this is the Ladies' Aid album. Back here we have the Soldier's Aid 9 patch. On the 9 patch, you have a border around the outside edge. So the block that I'm making for my red and tan quilt looks like this. I did not want this to be the only block in the whole series that had the border around the outside edge. So that's why I've taken some of the oddly sized blocks and reduced them to 6 inches, or finished them off at 6 inches and added a border around them. So that way all of my blocks for my quilt have more light edge to them. And then that way I can add darker sashing to them. And I didn't want just one with a border. So I made multiples with a border, and they'll be sprinkled throughout my quilt. So now we're going to move on to our next block. Our next block this month is number 26, which is called True Blue. Now this is a single page of instructions here, and you'll see that Number 26 in my book has this pink tab on the top. That pink tab indicates that if you look at the cover quilt all the way back here in the very beginning, you'll see that that block does not appear in the quilt. There are some blocks that are in the book that do not appear in the quilt, and obviously there's some in the quilt that do not appear in this book. This happens to be one of them. And this is also one of those blocks that sort of is a frustration for me because it's obviously a 9 patch that was then broken down so that you could make it an 8-inch block. And in order to do that, you get some of these funky instructions where you have to cut your squares a certain size and you have to make them, but then you have to trim them down to 3 1/8. And then you have to use scant seams in order to put them together. And that's just not an enjoyable piecing process for me. So once again, I've gone back and altered the instructions. I will give you a blue screen telling you what I've done here, but let me walk you through it. So in order to make this block, you need 4 corner squares, and those are half square triangles. Half square triangles are something that's easy for us to make, and in this case, these are 3-inch finished, so they're 3 1/2 raw edge to raw edge. And then I cut them from 4-inch squares and then square them up. So what you'll do is you'll take your squares, cut them in half diagonally, sew them together into pairs, and then put your ruler on there and square that up so that it measures 3 1/2 inches square. Your center piece then, so if this finishes at 3, so that would be 3 and 6. To get to an 8-inch block, we need a 2-inch piece here that we then add seam allowance to, so it would be cut 2 1/2. So our center square is cut 2 1/2. So that makes the basis of our true blue. And then you have squares that go here. And in the book, they are a 4-patch. So it's 4 squares that are sewn together, but we don't have squares, we have rectangles. So you can, if you would like, make a 4-patch that would be smaller. It would be a 2 1/2 inch raw edge to raw edge 4-patch to go there. What I did was make the regular 4 patches and then trim them down into rectangles. So to do that, you sew your squares together, and I sewed them into a 4-patch. These were 2-inch cut squares so that when we sew them together, they're going to fit right here. I then took my ruler, laid the center line down, the line on the center there, this way, and cut them so that they now measure 2 1/2. So pay attention to how they lay out. See how my gingham check is here and here? Then the one that goes on the side here, I cut opposite. So I cut this one with the check in the upper left-hand corner, and this one with the check in the upper right-hand corner, so that this will go on the side like that. And then the one that goes down here would be exactly the same as that, and the one that goes over here would be exactly the same as that. So it still gives me that tumbling look where the squares go side to side, and I think it'll make an interesting design when it's on point in my block. But instead of cutting and trying to do scant seam allowances and trimming to an 1/8, I just reoriented the block to make it an 8-inch finished block. I have 3-inch finished corners and 2-inch finished rectangles that are my 4 patches. My center square is 2 1/2 inches. So let me sew this together, and I'll give you a blue screen to tell you what I cut. But for the trimming, you'll have to pay attention to the video. So 2 1/2 by 3 1/2, 3 1/2, and 2 1/2 inch square. So this is my finished true blue block with the rectangles instead of the squares in between. Now, if the rectangles bother you, you could go ahead and square up your 4 patches to square. They'd be 2.5 inches from raw edge to raw edge. And then when you put them in here, you'll have to add a little bit of background to it. So it would set them down in, and you'd have a little bit of extra background around there, but then you could have squares as opposed to the rectangles. But this block is actually going to sit on point in my quilt, and I kind of like the look that this gives. For some reason it reminds me of a zipper, but I think it's a much more interesting block with the rectangles in it. So you can follow Barbara's instructions in the book. You can adjust your sizes to squares or rectangles. But that's our True Blue number 26. Next up is our log cabin block, which is number 29. This is a classic log cabin. The log cabin is noted as a center square that has strips added around it in either a clockwise or counterclockwise direction. And this particular log cabin has a center, and then they've added the dark, and then the light, and then the dark, and the light, and the light. Now, I think that rather than cut the 3 1/8 and the 1 7/8 inch that Barbara indicates in the book, if you just start with a 2.5 inch cut square, it will finish at 2 inches. And then your logs should be cut from strips that are 2 inches wide. Now they change length each time you cut them. And I highly recommend that you use a square up ruler and trim them each time and make sure that you're staying square so that when you add your logs, your square will be square when you're finished. This last one that you add will be cut 2 inches wide by 8.5 inches long because it goes the full width of the block. The other thing that you want to consider is whether you want to start with dark strips or light strips. For this particular layout, they added a dark strip and then a dark strip, then light and light. And that means if you start with the dark, you end with the light. So this block has more light in it than dark. So you can see how the dark strips are short of the edge of the block. Now, if you wanted it to be a darker block, which I think many of you may want, start with a light strip so that you have light, and then these 2 strips, these 4 actually, will be dark strips, and your block will appear darker and have less light. Now, whether you want it to be predominantly light or dark depends on the quilt that you're making. If you're using the sashing that's shown in the book, where you have 2 light strips and a dark strip in the center, then you're going to want to have a darker block so that it contrasts with the light sashing. In my case, for my red and cream, I prefer a lighter block because I'm going to use darker sashing. So I'm going to add dark first, but you might prefer to add light first. Now also, I made my block like this using 1 inch strips. So you can see I have my center square and then 1, 2, 3 pieces that were added to it. Where over here, Barbara only has 2. Mine is an 8 inch block as well, but my strips actually finish at 1 inch. So this is 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, 7, 8. Where on Barbara's block, these are 1.5 inch finished strips. So that's why I have more strips than you do. The other reason I have more strips than you do is I used the log cabin trim tool from Creative Grids. So in this case, what you do is you cut your center square, and then you continually line up the center square and trim so that you're constantly squaring up until you get all of your blocks put together. Now you can also see that instead of wrapping around, if you wanted to, you can do what's called a courthouse steps block. So in this little illustration that's in the center here, you can add to the top and the bottom, and then the left and the right, and then the top and the bottom, and then the left and the right, so that you'll have dark on this side of the block and this side, and light over here and over here. So you can adjust your log cabin block to however you would like. And if you have the log cabin trim tool in the 8 inch finish size, it's a handy way to make this block and add a little more interest to it by adding more strips. Our fifth and final block for this month is number 39, which is Kentucky Crossroads. Now, Kentucky Crossroads is a perfect block if you have a really wonderful stripe in your collection. So see how this stripe is fussy cut and there's a center square here? It's a great place to feature that kind of thing. I don't happen to have any wonderful stripes in my collection that will work with my red and cream, but I do have some repeating stripes that would be interesting in the triangle areas. This again, for this month, is one of those blocks that makes me shake my head. I have no idea why the cutting instructions are exactly what they are. So let's take a look at them. And working from the center out, this is C here in the center, which is a square. And Barbara has you cut one medium square, 2 3/8 inches. That's 1/8 of an inch shy of 2.5. This block doesn't relate to anything else, so I'm not sure why we don't cut that just 2.5. So I'm going to go with 2.5 inches. It's just 1/8 of an inch larger. Now that C relates to the A, so the A width has to be the same as the C block in the center. So for A, instead of 2 3/8 by 5.5, I'm going to cut 2.5 by 5.5. And I think that 5.5 is going to be large enough because we're enlarging that center square just slightly. But if you'd like to go from 5.5 to 5 3/4 or 6, you could certainly do that as well. Now, the B, she has a dark square, that's for the background here, that is 6 5/8. Why not just round that up to 7? Because I know how much you like to build your blocks and then square them up later, so it's much easier to just cut 7. And then that gets cut diagonally twice to form the 4 triangles that we're going to use as, I'm going to call them the background triangles. So when you go to put that together, we're going to sew the 2 large triangles on either side of a rectangle. And remember, this will have a rectangle. It will not be pointed on the end. It's not going to be pointed on the end until we square up the block. And then you're going to have a sashing strip, which will be 2 of the rectangles with a center square, and then the other 2 triangles on either side of one of those rectangles. So I've sewn that block together here, so you can see what mine looks like. While I don't have a real fun stripe to go in this area here, I'm using the repeating stripe here because I have this sort of a similar look in one other block in my quilt, and I don't want there to be a one and an only. I'm trying to repeat things every sort of at least 3 times. And then my center square here is fussy cut so that I do have something fun in the middle of it there. So now that I've got it sewn together, and I sewed these 2 to this, then these 2 rectangles to my center square, and these 2 triangles to here, and I've put them together. So now I'm going to square it up. I'm going to square it up the same way that I square up all of the other pieces using my 8.5 inch square ruler from Creative Grids. And I'm going to take that centering line that's right there. That's the white line that's in the middle of your ruler. And I'm going to run that line right through those points right there, vertically and horizontally, so that I know that I'm square. Now, because I'm using a striped fabric, I also want to check my 1/4 inch seam line all the way around here. So I need a little bit of an adjustment there so that I can get my 1/4 inch seams correct before I trim this. So that looks about right about there. Now, I'm going to trim my excess here. So remember, I enlarged my triangles slightly, and I enlarged my center slightly, so that's why I have this much around the outside edge to trim. So I'm going to take this to my rotating mat, and I'll use my rotating mat and trim this, and then block number 39, Kentucky Crossroads, will be finished, and all 5 December blocks will be complete. I hope you enjoy making these blocks, and that the little tips that I've given you for how to change them are helpful. Don't be afraid to use Barbara's measurements if you prefer to do it that way. But if the little tips have helped you, I'd appreciate you leaving me a comment here on YouTube so that I know that it's worthwhile doing these videos. Thank you so much, and I hope you all enjoy a wonderful holiday season.